Hi, everybody. This is Paul Edwards from Center for International Security and Cooperation and STS program, and I'm very, very happy to introduce our guest today, who is Professor Finn Brunton of the NYU Department of Media, Culture, and Communication. Finn is one of my favorite people and colleagues. He was at the University of Michigan when I was there. And during that time, he published his first book, Spam, A Shadow History of the Internet. And since then, he's published several more books. Obfuscation, A User's Guide for Privacy and Protest with Helen Nissenbaum. A book that's just out called Communication with Mercedes Bunz and Paula Bialski. And most recently, Digital Cash, The Unknown History of the Anarchists, Technologists, and Utopians Who Created Cryptocurrency. And I think that's what he'll be talking about today. And I think the last thing I want to say by way of introduction is that Finn is about to join the Bay Area STS community because he is going to be a professor at UC Davis in both media studies, right, and STS. So we're really pleased to welcome him to the Bay Area, and Finn, take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you, and in particular to dig into a part of digital cash as a technology and as a set of technologies that I wasn't really able to go into as much in the book as I would have liked, which is the implications of not just digital cash as such, and we'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that distinction and how it kind of plays into how we think about electronic money, but also blockchain platforms more generally. The implications of these technologies for how we think about security and stability, and in particular the paradox that I wanted to, that I brought up in the abstract for this talk and that I'd like to kind of start us off with, the paradox of how it is that a set of technologies can be simultaneously very attractive and exciting for communities that are fundamentally opposed to each other. How they can be very exciting and interesting for online illegal narcotics sales, and for banks that are trying to manage international settlement systems. How they can be so exciting for smugglers and for people who handle like securing logistics systems. How they can be so interesting both to governments and to groups that are primarily interested in destabilizing governments. I think understanding how we can reconcile these paradoxes, these different audiences and these very different groups that are adopting these technologies can help us understand better how these technologies themselves came to be. So part of what I would like us to think about is how we're talking about a family of technologies that have their roots in a set of competing agendas, competing social agendas, technical agendas, philosophical agendas. That's the underlying set of conditions that help them to kind of come into existence. And so I would like us to kind of be able to unpack those and tell some of those stories and understand some of those dynamics, and then think about what that means for the future of adopting these tools, and also how they can be enabling and empowering for such diverse and indeed like mutually exclusive organizations and movements. So the way that I'd like us to frame this, and then we can, and as we go, I hope we can also kind of keep it as a conversation and a dialogue. So I just have a very simple framework, which is that I would like us to start by thinking about the fundamental challenge of how you would create a token of digital money. Like what you would actually do, the sort of goals that you would be trying to meet in creating that. And then from there, maybe look a bit at some of the prototypes that people produced in an effort to answer that challenge. And then through all those, we will kind of see this paradox unfold. So the challenge of creating a token of digital cash is a really interesting one because it has to meet three very different needs. It actually has to meet three very different sets of goals. And I am suddenly having some trouble. There we go. It was just delayed for a second. The first goal is what I call the problem of secure paper, which is that when we think about money, we're usually thinking about two different kinds of thing. And one of them is a kind that we'll discuss in the next challenge, which we can call ledger money, right? Which is the kind of money that we use when we pay by check or credit card or engage in any one of the many kinds of transactions, which I think for most of us are most of the transactions we do now, especially in the era of COVID-19, which are transactions where we are electronically or abstractly shifting money from one place to another on a ledger, right? When we pay by credit card, when we pay by tap, when we pay by check, we are asserting, I have the right to access this money on this ledger, and I am now shifting some portion of that money over to someone else's entry on the ledger somewhere. We'll talk about that in a little while, but first, we should think about the sort of fundamental thing that we often think of when we think of money, which is token money. When we think of currency, we are thinking of token money. We are thinking of an object, a token, a bill, coin, some kind of physical thing, which is money itself. And the reason why this distinction matters, especially from a digital perspective, is that this is money that can authenticate what it is rather than having to authenticate who you are, right? When we do that now very rare thing of giving someone a $20 bill and getting change in return, the money is verifying itself as valuable and as authentic and as exactly what it claims to be in such a way that neither you nor I need to verify who we are. And there's a lot of technology and a lot of wonderfully kind of rich research and engineering that goes into making a token of money what it transparently appears to be. I would, if anyone wants to in the Q&A, talk more about the labor and technique that goes into securing paper. I would love to, because it's a very kind of rich and detailed area of work. But what I would like us to just bear in mind for what we're talking about when we talk about digital cash is this number one challenge, right? Figuring out how to secure a physical object so that it can be simultaneously easily recognizable, right? It has to be something where anyone can, under any set of possible conditions, can evaluate this physical thing, right? And think about all of the little somatic rituals that we do, that we've all encountered in various ways, right? You know, where people kind of like stroke the bill, right? They kind of rub it to see what its consistency is, which is very much a learned habit of understanding the particular material property that is going to be in a, like say a US dollar, which is mostly cotton actually, and not say something that came out of a color printer. Think about the ways that people will, like, you know, you look at it under the light, you can kind of evaluate a couple different things. You have that little pen you use to streak to look for the reactive inks. There's all these different small details that help you to authenticate that this is an object that you immediately recognize as being what it is, and that it can be evaluated as being real, authentic, as something that was produced by the mint that is actually what it is supposed to be. How would you do that in a digital form? How would you produce something that you could verify as being simultaneously a recognizable token value that is also unique? And by unique, I mean, how do you create a digital object that cannot just be, you know, Control C, Control P or V, like something that can be easily simply copied and pasted, easily replicated, or easily spent many times over as the same thing by the same person? So when we think a little bit about the work that goes into making physical tokens of money valuable, it gives us a sense of understanding the challenge of making a token of digital money valuable. And we can see the relics of the process of trying to make physical things secure all around us. This is just a detail that I love. This is reading on the edge of a coin, which serves a couple different kinds of secure functions, but the heart of reading actually began with the fact that when coins themselves were supposed to be not just a token of value, but the value of the metal in the coin, one of the ways that people could work around that is to clip, as it was called, right? Where you shave the edge of the coin with a very sharp blade. So you're shaving off these very fine slivers of precious metal. And if you accumulate enough of them, then you actually have like something, you know, quite valuable, while the coin in theory is still maintaining its face value. So you still can like trade the coin for the same worth that it had while saving this kind of additional worth for yourself. And over time, the coins become so degraded that people no longer trust them to carry their face value. So reading, which actually has an interesting relationship with the period when Isaac Newton was the head of the Mint. So reading has this property of trying to authenticate this physical object, right? It seems like being able to authenticate a physical object should be easy, but we need elements like this to say, this thing is what it appears to be. It says on the face of it that it contains this much metal. The reading is meant to confirm that if it is tampered with, that will be clear to us, that this thing is as valuable as it appears to be. And all of the currency that we transact has to carry all of these various technologies and tools aboard to confirm its value. All the kind of beautiful patterns that we associate with physical currency have their heritage in things like this. This is the product of something called the Rose Engine lathe, right? This beautiful physical cutting tool that makes these very swirly, you know, kind of oddly psychedelic gouache patterns that we see on paper currency. All of these are partially designed because they are easy for a machine to produce if you are etching a printing plate, and very hard for the human hand to reproduce. Right? They are like exceptionally difficult for people to easily replicate, but they are easy to recognize. So we can again think of the challenge of how would you make a digital thing that would work in that way? And so when we look at a $20 bill, we are looking at an exquisitely engineered machine that is designed to fulfill this function of being very easy to produce in large quantities and very, very difficult to replicate. This is a little bit of an aside, but one of the biggest challenges of that is figuring out how to make money so distinctive that it will be hard for people to pass things that are sort of money-like. And there's actually a whole headache for the Secret Service in the United States, which is cash that is produced for film shoots, for movies as props, right? Like you want the giant piles of money, you want the briefcase full of dollars, etc. So how do you produce something that from a distance can look good on camera, but up close will be clearly not actual money enough that no one will accept it? Because there's a wonderful history of the Secret Service having to kind of manage this process and sort of toe the line of authenticity, because as one Secret Service agent said, if it's green and says 20 on it, someone will accept it, right? So monetary tokens both have to be extraordinarily difficult to replicate, but also sufficiently complex and idiosyncratic that they can stand apart from things that merely appear to be like them. And we can again kind of think, what does the digital equivalent to this look like? And when we think about that challenge, that digital challenge, that actually already exists in physical currency. This is a detail that I love, and it's a detail that all of us presumably have either on our person or, you know, in our purse or somewhere nearby right now, which is this dot pattern. This is called the Orion Constellation. It's an anti-counterfeiting measure that was developed in the aftermath of the rise of like consumer grade, high resolution desktop publishing software and scanners and printers and so on. So this constellation, this dot pattern is actually encoded into the firmware at a very deep level of very high resolution scanners, printers, and you know, various forms of image management software like Photoshop and so on, such that if something is scanned in with this dot pattern on it, the software will refuse to recognize it. There is effectively a global agreement, a shared infrastructural understanding on the part of all of these major players that anything that has this pattern aboard will be identified as like a corrupt file and will not be able to be accessed. Which, when you think about it, it's kind of a marvelous thing. Yeah.
So this is in currency from many nations, all nations, this pattern?
Yes, yeah. So all of the major players, if you look on Durham's, it's usually like kind of stashed away in one corner. The euro usually hides it around the architectural features that they have on different things. But every major national currency carries the Orion Constellation, right? It's a publicly available resource that anyone who issues a currency can join. And there's something that should help us think about the scale of the challenge of making digital money, in the fact that for analog money to be able to keep itself from being easily copied, they had to come up with this like secret omerta agreement among, you know, Canon and Adobe and like every like Panasonic, like every company that would potentially make equipment that could be used to reproduce currency had to get on board with writing this in at a sufficiently deep level that they could refuse to sort of touch and replicate these tools. So if you don't have the economic institutional firepower to create a like trans-border agreement between all these different companies, how would you go about trying to secure money from replication? And how would you have the techniques to make sure that you could verify when you needed to that a particular token of digital money could be distinguished from, you know, a fake, a counterfeit, a forgery, something that had been modified? I just love this image. So these are Treasury employees at work in the period of, there was a series of breakthroughs, destabilizing breakthroughs in counterfeiting, the so-called Supermetal Problem. How do you go about verifying that a particular note is in fact authentic if you have a copy that's sufficiently good enough? There's all these amazing details of the handful of people in the world who know like which parts of the plates are wearing faster than other parts, such that there's like tiny mistakes that might be present in one detail of, you know, like the little car that's driving by in front of the Capitol building on a bill that would not be present on, for example, clean plates that had been manufactured, in this case, most likely for East German spies, and then just kind of kicked around in the backwaters of the post-Cold War world for a while, and were still like fresh enough that some of those details of wear were not present. How would you have any kind of equivalent for something digital? How would you be able to engage in this kind of careful forensic work to secure a digital token of currency? So that's the first challenge that we can think about, right? Like the challenge of the fact that you don't get any of these forms of physical security or physical cues if you're trying to build a digital token of money. And the second brings us back to the idea of ledger money, right? Of the fact that, well, okay, you can easily sidestep this problem of securing the money if what you do is secure the identity of the person who transacts the money. And the problem with that, the problem that was apparent to computer scientists in the 1970s, was the fact that they all knew from a very early stage that networked computers were going to dramatically alter how we engaged in commerce. There's many different things we could talk about in this, many dimensions, but they were very foresightful in understanding this. But they also knew that there was not yet in place any good mechanism whereby those tools could be implemented that would not rely on surveillance, that would not rely on having methods that you could use to definitively identify the person who is engaged in the transaction so that you could authorize that transaction for them. And this leads to one of my favorite examples of this. So the great computer scientist, Paul Armour, who I wanted to bring up in this case specifically because he was actually very closely involved with Stanford and the Stanford Research Institute, and he was in Palo Alto. So this is a paragraph that he wrote in which he described a mission that he and a group of other scientists who are closely connected with Department of Defense and so on were given in the 1970s, which was, we want you to like game out, develop scenarios for what the KGB will be building next to engage in large-scale surveillance of their population. What do you create? With the one proviso that it cannot be too obtrusive or too obvious. It has to be subtle. Given the trajectories of computing technology, what would you produce? And we know all of this because Armour was actually delivering a lot of this information in the testimony that he gave to Congress in 1975, in which he described the outcome of the project that they were given. And in particular, the fact that they should be concerned not just with the implications of surveillance for computers generally in some broad, vague sense, but specifically in the design of electronic fund transfer systems, EFTSs. Because an electronic funds transfer system was what his group developed as the mechanism by which you could create an ideal form of surveillance that would not be too obtrusive, too obvious, but would allow an extraordinarily detailed and fine-grained level of surveillance and control over an entire population. What Armour presented, and he was not alone in this, many other scientists, political figures, activists were already thinking along these lines, is a mechanism whereby if you want to buy or sell, you have to use the EFTS system. And if you use that, then of course, and we should all be familiar with this because it's kind of the way we live now, you provide information not just about yourself, but of course it's time-stamped. It's about when and where something took place, right? There's like the point of sale tool that can definitively identify that this payment, this purchase happened at such and such a time, at such and such a place. And of course, you also have the data about the purchase itself. And EFTS can fold in, as Armour was sort of envisioning this dystopian future, can fold in all of the information about what you are buying. And if you can do that, and if it's all digital and it's all taking place in real time, then you can engage in forms of subtle but powerful and omnipresent real-time coercion and control, right? Like you can set something up where you know, you can bring the book in the bookstore to the counter and you like swipe your card and then your payment is declined. Not because your credit isn't good, but because you are not to buy that particular book. And the system knows that and the system can refuse to accept your money for it. Or you can buy that book and then set off, you know, who knows what automated dossiers and who knows what alarm bells somewhere. For Armour, this was a prospect not just of surveillance, but of a tremendous possibility for social control. And this was a fear that was widely shared and widely understood at the time. In some ways, a fear that was kind of forgotten or neglected for a while. David Chaum, one of the great pioneers of digital cash technology, likewise tied into Stanford in some interesting ways, was very alert to this. And he likewise said, when we talk about the future of digital money, this was also in his congressional testimony a decade later, we should think about the future as being one where we are not buyers and sellers in a marketplace, but where we are, and this is his phrase, electronically tagged cattle in feedlots, right? Where our prices, our ability to purchase, to exchange, all of those things are not just monitored, but managed and controlled. So that is likewise, obviously, not a good solution to the problem of digital money. And it's another challenge that we have to think about, another goal, right? A digital token of money should not be generating data about the people who are transacting it outside of their control. It should not be something that relies on being able to definitively identify this person engaged in this purchase, or else all kinds of abuse are potentially enabled. And because it's such a memorable example, I want to include the fact that Margaret Atwood was, I think this really speaks to, sorry, cat break, just a second. I think that really speaks to the cultural ubiquitousness of this fear, and then the sort of forgetting of this fear after a little while, because we forget that The Handmaid's Tale is in many ways a dystopia about electronic money. Because she makes it very clear at the outset of the book that the sort of, you know, misogynist patriarchal Republic of Gilead comes into being because credit is electronic and it's all connected with databases. This is in the early 1980s. And that means that credit that belongs to women can be identified and frozen, right? Like assets that belong to women can be easily stopped from being able to be used. And by the time the kind of, you know, coercive republic is in full swing, Atwood explains in depth how the money in it functions, which is that men and women have access to different kinds of money, and women only get tokens that can be used for specific kinds of goods. There's no ability to engage in any form of free transaction or to accumulate anything that could make available individual personal choices, any kind of access to freedom. So I think it's really worth it for us to remember that this is another challenge that the people who built digital cash have very much in their minds. Not just how to protect privacy in the generic, but how to prevent an outcome in which money can be used to track people, but also to coerce people, to price gouge them, to redline their purchases, to manage their ability to engage in the economic world. The last of these three challenges is one that is more specific to the milieu that a lot of the people who were developing digital cash were in, which was a libertarian and kind of Austrian economic milieu. But there is a larger concern there beyond the sort of specifics of their philosophy that helps us understand the challenge that they were trying to address, which is the problem of surety. And that is to say, in a larger sense, if you are creating some kind of new money, how do you guarantee that that new kind of money will retain some semblance of value over time, right? Like, how do you have some sense of assurance in the fact that it will continue to hold the value that's been put into it? And the form that this generally takes, this, believe it or not, is not the last James Bond reference that is going to come up in this for what I hope is a good reason. The common form that this takes, the reflexive form that this takes in the libertarian and heterodox economic milieu that people who are making digital cash were immersed in, was gold, precious metals, right? Like, we, obviously gold is not inherently valuable, et cetera, but the upshot for our purposes is that, okay, here's a precious, scarce substance whose scarcity is unreliable in the sense that, as we know from the history of money, a major gold strike, a huge discovery, could actually like dramatically inflate available credit, and then things run out and there's a sudden reduction in credit and so on. But at its heart, the premise of this idea is that you have some kind of verifiably scarce substance. You have some object, as Auret Goldfinger is pointing to here, Fort Knox, which can be stored and managed and accounted for and has some level of known and measurable, quantifiable scarcity. And that provides the surety, right? The sense that if money is, for instance, backed by gold, then it will retain some form of value over time. Now, I've actually encountered a great deal of this in practice, because when I started doing research for the digital cash book, I wanted to find people who are engaging in day-to-day transactions using digital currencies. And most of the people in the world that I could find who were doing that, this was about 7 or 8 years ago now, were libertarians. And they were engaging in two different kinds of transactions. So I would go to libertarian enclave events of various kinds, go into the backwoods of New Hampshire, where the beard really blends in. And then I would encounter the forms of transaction that were being done were either in various cryptocurrencies or in things like this. This is a Lancaster trading house in New Hampshire. And the reason why they're offering these deals with these particular year or before coins is that those had some measurable quantity of silver in them. And so therefore they had like a different metallic value. The FRN that you see on that sign that they are so dismissively referring to as a Federal Reserve note, or as the rest of us would call it, a dollar. But so this is, right, this is like this very specific economic approach that's premised on this idea that there is a kind of inherent value to the scarcity of these objects. So we can again start to think, how would we find an analog, if we wanted to find an analog for that surety in digital form, what would that look like and how would it work?
I wonder if the hot soft hempsel is equally scarce. That's why it's bartered for this amount.
No, absolutely. Like, and that's part of the for them, right? And again, we're also kind of seeing this as an element of, and we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, but one of the things that threads through this is that they're trying to find technical solutions, but those technical solutions are always at heart social, right? Like, you can come up with these beautiful technical fixes for creating a scarce digital coin, but then what ultimately makes it valuable is the fact that you can convince other people that that scarcity is valuable in the same way that, like, the social act of engaging in barter by trying to find 1964 or before quarters and then trading them for a hempsel is, you know, a meaningful transaction. And to that point, actually, so the reason why I wanted to take us on this brief aside was that the first really successful online payment platforms because right, credit card infrastructure had already existed for quite a long time, but it was relatively slow to find like ways to work within web browsers. The first really successful online payment platforms were all precious metal based, and they all emerged from the context of libertarian activism and economics. So, you know, the sort of the companies that did business before PayPal, and in some cases were more successful than PayPal was for quite a long run until PayPal was saved by eBay, were companies that had names like DigiGold, eGold, or in this case, the Silver Liberty Dollar system, in which this dude who lived in Hawaii and had a warehouse in Idaho, which was filled with silver ingots, which you could buy portions of. You would hold these warehouse receipts, but the actual way you would transact value was with the digital warehouse receipt that you would transact over a payment platform. This was a way in which a great deal of business was actually done, entirely premised on the idea that these were digital tokens of value that corresponded to a physical scarce object.
Yeah, I'm noticing, you just didn't point this out, but I'm seeing that there are dates on these, and this one is 2008, and the one that you just showed was 2006.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And you can also, one of the reasons why I have all of this documentation is, I was going to say is because like I love doing archival research, but in this case, it's because this is actually all FBI material that was released in the course of, you know, public discovery, because all of this was also kind of bringing us back to the goal number 2, the problem of privacy surveillance. All of this stuff was being transacted over ledgers, right? This was all what we would call ledger money, which meant that it all was sitting on specific servers. And this kind of carries us forward to some of the problems of stability. It was all very quickly being used for illegal purposes, you know, with some exceptions. There were a few people who, well, let's just be blunt about it. If you wanted to, you know, buy a lawnmower or a fire extinguisher or a bag of groceries, there were much easier ways to do it than this incredibly convoluted process. But if you wanted to do a bunch of like under the table deals for like illegal firearms with someone, like this was a way that was culturally significant if you were really into illegal firearms, and also a kind of payment that they were much more likely to accept. A lot of the different precious metal payment platforms ended up being shut down because of the fact that they ended up seeing a lot of use by money launderers, by people who, by scammers who were trying to find various ways to, you know, transform money into other kinds of money in ways that were somewhat like laundering, lots of tax avoidance, and drug dealing. So these were all kind of like, you know, as soon as someone opened one of these new under-regulated payment platforms, they kind of got flooded with early adopters who were really interested in using these digital warehouse receipts, you know, corresponding to bars of silver for whatever illegal purpose.
Then we have a question from Debak who wants to know, is there any particular reason it says negotiable on the note? Is the value later negotiable? And
oh, yes. Yeah.
For a second, I just wanted to say, I'm mindful of the time, and I know you've got a lot more to say, so.
Yeah, so I will, so I'll speak very briefly to this, and then, so we're about to like jump into talking about some different technical prototypes, and then we'll, and then I'll be kind of wrapped up and we can Q&A. But one of the kind of interesting aspects of the negotiability of this is the fact that there are a lot of complex rules around how things can present themselves as not being currency. Because if they do, they're by and large illegal, right? Like something that is, that presents itself as quote unquote passing current is actually like falls under the remit of the Secret Service to try to regulate. So there's a lot of like interesting fringe cases, but in this case, that's why this always presents itself as a receipt. Why the coins that they stamped were always sold as medallions that had numismatic negotiable value, but in no sense presented themselves as having things that had face value as money. There's a lot of interesting and very kind of arcane issues around that really come into play when you're looking at digital currency. So I wanted to take a little time to really lay out these 3 challenges so we could think about how hard it would be conceptually to create something that could simultaneously be like a secure, unique object, but also digital and easy to recognize, that generates no data about the people who are transacting it or what they're transacting, and that also can somehow maintain a sense of its own value, that you can have some form of verifiable trust in its relative scarcity. So how do you prototype something like that? And so I'd just like to throw out a sort of array quite quickly of some different examples of how people would try to produce an object like that. Starting with this woman, Jude Milan, who is a programmer and a writer. Here she's being arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, as part of the march with Martin Luther King Jr., who coined the name for the community that she had found in the Bay Area, the community of cryptographers who called themselves cypherpunks, or rather whom she called cypherpunks. And I wanted to include this, which is from the email where she gave them that name and described their overall mission and kind of narrated their project back to them because of this quote that it opens with. The alternative to mutual trust, which is indeed a risky gamble, is the security of the police state. And that, I think, really gives us a sense of how they were thinking about the prototypes that they were trying to build. That they were simultaneously anti-authoritarian while also enabling some form of mutual trust. And she created this wonderful series of fictional vignettes where she outlined the future that they were envisioning. And she's talking in her story to a couple of people based on real people that she knew who are trying to build the infrastructure to, as it says here, make things untakeoverable, to build systems of secure, anonymous finance and secret monetary exchange and reputation, untaxable, beyond the capacity of any government to regulate, that would produce this kind of mutual trust global network that would operate outside the ability of the state to manage. And one of the first stabs at this project, and we'll just go very briefly through some of these to give you some ideas of different versions of this, was a project called Blacknet, created by an anarchist, a crypto anarchist as he called himself, named Tim May, who summarized his whole project in the little signature on his email here. Crypto anarchy, which begins with encryption and digital money, goes through the following steps to what is his ultimate goal: collapse of governments. May was a problematic figure in many ways, but I admire how clear he was about his project. He ultimately wanted to create a proliferating global network of secret black markets, a flood of untaxable, unmanageable cash, which would ultimately lead to the collapse of global order. And it's replaced with virtual communities, which would eventually, take over the world effectively and replace it with something else under conditions of crypto anarchy. And what he did as one of the steps towards kind of building on these ideas was he created a hoax called Blacknet. He presented this hoax in the form of a straight-faced email. This is the opening line. "Your name has come to our attention." Blacknet presents itself as a completely covert, completely encrypted, completely secret online global marketplace for information, for secrets. The buying and selling of these secrets will underwrite the value of digital cash, right? Like, you will sell secrets to Blacknet, and in return, you'll get these like crypto credits or like other forms of money. And then you can use those to like arbitrage secrets of your own or buy other illegal things, and you'll have like skin in the game. And I love thinking about Blacknet because this is Ken Adam, who is the set designer for many of the James Bond movies. So I think captured the image of Cold War power in a very pure way, of what Paul has described as the closed world discourse, right? Like all of those like huge enclosed subterranean super bases filled with gantries and missiles and so on. And what May outlines in Blacknet is a really coherent vision of what postmodern, post-1990s, like, secret supervillain power would look like, which is not a base, not a central system, but instead a pervasive, invisible network in which everyone is afraid of everyone else. Everyone's a potential informant, and waves of sloshing secret money move around the world, destabilizing governments as they go. And I wanted to highlight the Blacknet project in particular because it wasn't just a prototype with a fair amount of technical thought into how it would work, but one that actually inspired 2 real-world projects. And actually, I'll skip through this part and then come back to it in a second, because one of the things that it inspired directly was WikiLeaks. Assange has credited May numerous times with the fact that Blacknet was one of the inspirations for the model of the idea of how WikiLeaks would work. With, again, the goal, this is Assange in correspondence with the cypherpunk list, talking about specifically how you would create some kind of trusted digital information that could not be read now, but could be released at some point in the future as like a form of insurance or a hostage. But Assange actually outlined the fact that for him, a system that could work like this would be able to effectively shut down and destabilize major institutions. Not, and I think this is one of the really interesting ways of thinking about Assange and the WikiLeaks project as a whole, not, Assange is very clear, through just releasing the information. That's almost secondary, right? Like releasing secrets to the public, creating public unrest, all of the rest of that stuff. That's actually a helpful side effect. But the core of it is the fact that if you use a Blacknet model, then you are effectively turning everyone inside an organization into a potential threat. You create a system that is rife with internal paranoia, as he calls it. His goal, as he puts it in Conspiracy as Governance, this is one of Assange's very early papers, is to effectively throttle the operation of the institution through creating an atmosphere of pervasive distrust, fear, paranoia, and greed. Except, of course, ultimately, WikiLeaks decides to abandon the idea of using a financial incentive to make this system work and instead rely on sort of models of whistleblowing and social justice. The other major inspiration that was adopted from Blacknet, which is a totally different kind of vector for how we think about stability and security as based in these platforms, I'll skip over that too, is the Silk Road. Blacknet is a really extraordinary thing because it's a single email hoax that effectively had this extraordinary set of two afterlives, where one we can see in the WikiLeaks model and the other we can see in the Silk Road. We can see in the project that Ross Ulbricht created. This is at a museum in DC. I love it. This is the exhibit of Ross Ulbricht's Silk Road laptop, with which he was arrested by the FBI at a public library in San Francisco in the process of the kind of super elaborate sting. But again, right, when we look at sort of prototypes and visions for how digital cash could function socially in terms of security, stability, new orders, new systems, think about the fact that this object, this single laptop, and then a handful of onion servers were able to sustain this extraordinary distributed global narcotics infrastructure, basically. Ross Ulbricht was able to build ultimately at the end of the day, quite well organized, but on the face of it, highly distributed, decentralized, more or less emergent eBay-like marketplace for buying and selling illegal drugs. And when we go back to Tim May's model, we can see the spirit of what the Silk Road would be in that, not just in the idea of creating an illegal marketplace, but in the idea that for May, what would make digital cash valuable? What would get people to buy into the value of a digital cash token? It would be the fact that you could use that to get access to things that you were forbidden, right? Like you could use that to buy and sell secrets and then make a bunch of money off of those to be, homegrown industrial espionage. You could use that to engage in various forms of money laundering and so on. But you could also use it to get access to drugs. And Ross actually had a whole kind of worked out philosophy called agorism that's based on a larger libertarian ideology, that finding ways to incentivize people to engage in transactions outside state control is a series of steps towards the ultimate destabilizing of the state itself.
Well, didn't he, maybe I'm not stealing your punchline, but wasn't he
No.
arrested for hiring hitmen to?
yes, yeah.
That's another thing you can do with digital cash.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, it really, like, Ross's whole story is such an amazing object lesson in the fact that this system, which is premised on a philosophical commitment to the purity of the marketplace as something that can function without coercion and without the possibility of violence, ends up like falling apart largely because he ends up having to spend a fair amount of time and energy and actionable evidence to use violence to maintain order and sort of the structural hierarchy of the system that he's created. But yeah, at heart, right, the notion, the premise here is what will make the digital cash token valuable? When we look back at the agendas involved in its creation, for a lot of the people involved, the goal was to create something, not just that would facilitate illegal transactions, but rather the illegal transactions were the stepping stone towards making digital cash into something that could undercut the stability of the state, that could undercut the ability of the state to function in various ways. And with that in mind, I would like to just briefly skim back to look for a moment at the other answer that fed into this, right? So we jumped from Blacknet to Silk Road, and now I'd like us to rewind a little bit, because Blacknet was still not able to answer the question, what does the money actually look like? Like, how does it work? Because no one at this stage, like, people have all these different theories about how to make it valuable, but if you're trying to build a currency that does not rely on trusting the state to be able to manage the currency and produce, you know, sort of trusted currency tokens, then what do you make? And so I'd just like to very briefly, and I'd be happy to dig into this more technically if anyone would like to, but I'd just like to briefly touch on the ways that they end up thinking about how to answer that and how it ties the first challenge and the third challenge together, which was, the solution was, well, can we make tokens, digital tokens, that are unique and that are verifiably scarce? How do you do that? Well, this is a lovely kind of moment of synthesis. The solution that evolves is, okay, what if we could come up with some way that we could make your computer do a certain amount of work, and then we could verify that it had done that portion of work. And the more powerful computers become, the harder we can make the work that we demand. And there happens to be a very beautiful kind of sort of cryptographic solution for this, which is a partial hash collision system, effectively, which is something where you can basically say, I have an arbitrary puzzle. I don't know how to solve the puzzle, but I can make the puzzle some amount of difficult. I know how long roughly it will take, how much time it will take to guess the answer to the puzzle. And the original goal of this, beautifully, was to, in the hacker community, was to use this to make it a little bit expensive to send email, so that you would never notice if you were engaging in back and forth emailing, but if you were spamming hundreds of thousands of people, it would become incredibly onerous and energy and time consuming. So out of this, a series of solutions evolved, which were, we could have different kinds of tokens. This is Hal Finney, who was Satoshi Nakamoto's correspondent, the second person in the world to run Bitcoin, the recipient of the second Bitcoin transaction. And this is very, very early on in the 1990s, where he's saying, if we have these objects that demand something from their creator, a proof of work, then we can find ways to maybe make them reusable, so they can keep circulating as tokens of money might. So it's, again, kind of a solution that evolves out of thinking about these as scarce. This is where we can see some of the ideas of making it like gold. This is the first place that we begin to see the idea of mining emerging as part of the discourse of this, of talking about running this computational time to solve these problems as mining. But the goal, which I would always like us to kind of bear in mind as we go to the very last part of this talk, the goal is always to come up with something that can have an analog for the scarcity of a precious metal, which is another, like, perverse layer on top of the layers of problems to solve in creating digital cash. But I hope we can see how it speaks to addressing a couple different challenges all at once, right? If you can figure out something that behaves like gold, as Nick Szabo calls it, BitGold, then you will have something that doesn't rely on trust in money granting institutions, can be somehow verified in itself as being a scarce, unique object, and can also be verified as such without needing to verify the probity or trustworthiness of you as the transactor.
Finn, you know, this is fascinating. The proof of work idea in this context of gold is really interesting, because the scarcity of gold is not really just its physical scarcity, but the fact that it is so difficult to get. And that means, you know, the suffering of thousands, hundreds of thousands of miners in a place like South Africa is what the work involved in getting the gold is all about. So its scarcity is related to human work. And what they're doing here is transferring that to the computer.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's a really I mean, it's one of these like metaphors that breaks down instantly, examination in many different ways. But it's interesting because in some ways, it's that they are replicating the cultural understanding of gold, as it were, and kind of the social infrastructure around gold, rather in many ways than gold itself, right? Because absolutely, the production of gold is scarce, not just because of its relative scarcity in like the Earth's crust, but also because of the fact that it is very challenging and wasteful and destructive to actually acquire. But also that they figured out how to open doors since quarantine began, so we're really in trouble now. But also what really fascinates them, and this is part of what Szabo is in fact writing about in the piece I have on the slide, is the way in which gold has this incredibly detailed provenance, right? Like you can keep track of exactly like where it came from, which vaults it was in at different stages, like everything is stamped and assayed and like very carefully scrutinized. And they want to replicate not just the challenge of the acquisition, but having a monetary object which permits this kind of very detailed knowledge. In fact, when I was interviewing mint masters in New Hampshire, so people who run like illegal or semi-legal monetary systems where they will like mint their own silver, one of them said, I have no objection to a paper currency, as long as it would be publicly accessible and it was like a matter of, you know, basically if it was available for us as citizens to vote on and to manage when and how that currency was created, how much of it was produced, you know, under what conditions, if we were able to like verify how it was being secured and created. Come on, Pat. If we were able to publicly verify how it was generated. He said the beauty of silver, and this was an amazing phrase of his, is that, as he put it, silver is silver and the weight is the weight. You know, like it's this kind of very specific form of knowledge. So they're trying to create digital objects that would have that same level of forensic knowledge. And I think when we look at things like Bitcoin, we start to really see how that plays out in practice. And actually, I'll pass over this part because I want to get us to the other place in which this question of, like how this question of assurance starts to connect into this. Because now we have a technology for producing verifiably scarce digital objects, right? This proof of work tool that can, you know, create something where you can say, I can demonstrate provably that like these can only be produced at a rate of like, say 1 every 10 minutes, you know, or 1 every X number of watts or X number of CPU cycles. So now you have those objects. How do you transact them with the assurance that someone has not just literally cut and pasted a proof of work string and like use that again as another scarce payment tool? You need some way of tracking all of them, some master ledger system that can keep track of how they all move, very much in the spirit of how if you were buying one of these, if you were buying a unit of one of these gold bars on a precious metal payment platform in the 1990s, it would come with its lineage. It would come with a whole list that told you exactly how much gold in grains, where it was, under what conditions, where it came from, and so on. So what I would like to help us think about is yet another agenda that then enters this story, is that part of the basis for the system that becomes the blockchain lies in the sciences, and lies specifically, again, in another problem of trustlessness, which is we have all these physical mechanisms for securing the validity of scientific results, right? And not the validity of scientific results, I mean the scientific research. So we have like bench notebook systems so that there's ways for people to have like entered information such that we can go back and prove that there was no like fiddling with the numbers. In the very first blockchains emerge from this context. And my wonderful colleague, Amy Whitaker, has actually tracked down the people who developed this and the specific Friendly's restaurant in New Jersey where this idea was first produced. But a lot of the infrastructure of what we now think of as the blockchain begins with a system called surety for timestamping scientific results. And the way you would do that was by embedding those timestamps into a blockchain, which would then be, and this is marvelous to me, publicly verifiable by the fact that the hash of the state of the blockchain registry was printed in the lost and found section of the classified ads in the New York Times on a regular basis. So you would have this kind of public verification tool for being able to confirm that all of the digital records that had been notarized were still accurate. So this is a very unusual solution, but it's one that gets folded into this whole story because it provides a mechanism whereby you can theoretically have a way to prove that a token of money has been created at such a time, transacted between these people. This person no longer has access to it. This person now does, in this public ledger system. So all of these, and I'll kind of skim through the last stage of this. If anyone wants to talk in detail about the state of modern drug dealing, I'd be very happy to. I've been doing a lot of research into that. But what all of these systems, sorry?
What kind of research?
Oh, I've been taking advantage of people that I got in touch with when I was working on the spam book, because spammers, while not drug dealers, have a lot of the same ancillary industries that they need to be involved with, right? Like ways to, like I'm talking smaller scale people here too, not cartels or anything like that, but ways to turn particular kinds of transactions into kinds of money that they can safely spend. And in particular, ways of being able to move contraband around in small quantities securely and secretly. This is a new thing. It's still very small scale. I'm very attached to it, called drop gangs. These are the next step in trying to secure anonymity of transactions. So the idea is that you're a drug dealer, you have some chunk of, you have 40 MDMA pills or whatever, you break them up into units of 4, and then you, get them in something watertight, some great little like pill container, and then you conceal that. Sometimes with a little Bluetooth beacon with very specific geo coordinates somewhere in the landscape. And then weeks or months down the line, you sell those pills to somebody. And instead of having to physically interact with them in any way, even to the level of mailing things, which is one of the downfalls of the Silk Road, you instead can give them the coordinates. And maybe like, this is an example. So this is a screenshot of a drop gang deal where they've left this Coke bottle, right? And they're saying like, dig under the snow at the bottom of this tree behind that curving branch, and you'll find your, MDMA that you bought with Bitcoin over messaging that entirely took place over an encrypted messaging app. And in theory, if all of this works according to plan, there's no way for us to at all be connected ever. One of the many downsides to this is that they've had to make their hiding places more and more careful because drug users, being drug users, the thing that happens is that you make a buy from a drop gang guy, you go there, you get the stash, and then you just search through the whole area nearby on the assumption that they would have maybe hidden other things around, which usually they have. So then you just like clean out everything else, and then they're selling drugs that are no longer there to other now extremely angry people. Yes, there's a lot of potential kind of flaws in the system, but this is still very much an example of kind of areas where cryptocurrency and the sort of early agendas of cryptocurrency still hold, right? That's still where a lot of transactions are taking place that are not just pure financial speculation, are like transactions around trying to buy or sell things where you want the transactions themselves to be anonymous. So this is where I'd like to close. I'd like us to think about some of the paradoxes of trying to build these trustless distributed systems, because they turn out to be technologies that have a lot of practical applications for processes of security and stability, but they are at heart systems that present us with a kind of double-edged sword and with a new set of vulnerabilities. So this beautiful object is an art piece. But it's a working art piece. So this is a functioning Tor node, right? So this is an anonymous online network, right? Like a dark market app, transactions for Silk Road style dark markets very likely took place over it, but also for being able to provide access to all forms of banned information and access safely and securely for people who are living under authoritarian regimes, right? Like this thing is called the Autonomy Cube. It's just an art version of a Tor node. It was made by Trevor Paglin and Jacob Appelbaum. But the reason why I wanted to show it is that this is an object that is simultaneously decried by, let's say, the FBI as a tool that enables all forms of malfeasance, but it's also like a product of research from the US Navy. Like the US Naval Research Lab like made this technology possible. It's a system that was beloved for a long time of the State Department. I no longer know if it is quite as much, but because of the fact that it enabled dissidents to operate safely in the context of authoritarian and very surveillance-centric political systems. So when we look at the kinds of platforms and tools that were being developed around digital cash, I think we can really see things that give us a similar and very closely related question of how we understand the maintenance of stability for good and for ill, right? Like these were platforms that were in some cases created explicitly with the goal of like dodging taxes and enabling, you know, black market transactions and eventually destabilizing governments. But they also enable many forms of behavior and many kinds of interaction practices that governments might want to make possible when it comes to things like escaping authoritarian pressure and coercion. It's really interesting to try to think about how we model that paradox for ourselves when we think about these technologies and what they might hold for us in the future. They also open a lot of other challenges that are really worth thinking about. One of the sort of the stinger in the tail, as it were, of the trustless, completely uninstitutional infrastructure of a system like Bitcoin is the fact that there is no fallback position. There's no trusted third party. There's no trusted institution. And what that means in practice is that if you lose your one and only password for getting access to a wallet on the Bitcoin blockchain, then you lose all that money for good and forever. This is an extremely valuable landfill in Wales, where James Howells, who was a really early Bitcoin adopter, who then kind of walked away from it for a while, essentially by accident threw out the hard drive on which the cryptographic key for getting access to his Bitcoin existed, and then has been haunted by it ever since. This poor guy, he figured it out like months and months later and went to the landfill, and they like worked out with him the pace at which the bulldozer moves around adding new landfill. So basically an area the size of a football field has something in it that's the size of a pack of cigarettes that when he threw it away was worth virtually nothing, because Bitcoin was still just a fun like hacker toy. And then at the time he was trying to recover it was worth tens of millions of dollars. But the money, the thing is, the money is not there, right? The Bitcoin tokens, this is where they live on the blockchain, this string, like you can go and look at them. They're just sitting there, and they will continue to sit there forever, because as a trustless system, there is no backup infrastructure in which a human can intervene to try to like sort of manage things. A lot of the people from Treasury that I talked to when I was writing the book, so the sort of libertarians and hackers that I knew would talk about Bitcoin, and they talk about the Fed and Treasury as though like these people are terrified of these things because they are going to replace them. They're going to render them irrelevant. And the people that I talked to who actually worked in those institutions were scared of it for reasons of contagion, right? They were scared of a huge speculative bubble that these things would fire up. People would put tons of assets into them, sucking them out of other areas of the economy. And then it would collapse. And then that would create all of these like negative knock-on economic destabilization effects. So when we think about what it means to build a trustless system, part of what is interesting to think about is what do we actually get out of the process of enabling people to manage things, right? Like what do we actually get out of the process of a certain amount of human intervention and oversight in the ability to be able to, for example, inject more liquidity into an economy, rather than having, as is the case with Bitcoin, an algorithm that is basically providing a specific amount of currency in measured doses in response to specific units of work on schedule. And finally, and this is kind of the last thing, I wanted to close with this sign, which is from a Libertarian Enclave event, again in New Hampshire, which is right, like they really capture it. Like the promise of Bitcoin is that it's a trustless system. You can evaluate the performance of the whole system for yourself. You can evaluate how much Bitcoin is in play, how much of it is being transacted, which accounts hold it, how much is being introduced into the system, blah, 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 blah. You can survey all those things yourself. There's no trust involved. But what we end up ultimately coming back to is that the value of money is an act of trust, of course, right? Like the value of money is the trust in the fact that other people will continue to think as you do, that they will accept the money that you're trying to pass as valuable, that they will accept it at roughly the same value that you accepted it, that you will be able to have that sense of knowledge about the near future within which these transactions or speculations will take place. So when we think about how these things play out for the future, I think one of the things that we should think about is what it means to be trying to build these forms of trustless digital infrastructure, and what that means we're actually putting our trust in, right? Like what that means we are actually trying to rely on for the use of these technologies. So I hope this is a good way to kind of lay out some paradoxes, and we can now have a little bit of a conversation about this.
Yeah, well, we've got one question in the chat, in the Q&A, which I'll get to in a minute, but if anybody else has questions or comments, please use the Q&A button, and happy to bring those in. I mean, I am really, really struck by an aspect of this paradox, not necessarily a different one, but it's, I already mentioned it earlier, which is that I've had in mind for a long time writing a paper whose title would be "You Just ... because so many things of this nature rely on the concept that there's something relatively simple that you do that isn't really, it's really challenging. And we see that kind of language all over the place around technical objects. You just do this, and then your will work or whatever. And this is an example of that, where the actual effort involved for people in making use of the system, in this case, Bitcoin or any digital currency, really is much bigger than the way it appears if you only look at the system itself. So separating out the digital currency system from the human transactions that are using it is kind of a necessary feature of how this whole line of thought works.
Yeah, yes, totally. And it really, like, that is such a part of the kind of necessary sleight of hand that's involved in this. And I think it's also one of the really interesting things for how we think about the sort of threats and promises that systems like these offer for how we think about security and stability in the future, right? In the sense that, like, you know, a lot of people have written, a lot of like sort of anthropologists of money have written about exactly this problem when it comes to digital cash stuff, right? Which is that there is simultaneously, and that's what I meant by sleight of hand, there is simultaneously always this rhetoric of like, this stuff is real the way prime numbers are real. This stuff is real the way rocks are real. Like, this is, you know, bedrock ontological reality here. That's what makes this money into money. And they make that argument in the countless like evangelical YouTube videos and, you know, songs and like white papers and tweets and endless social performance and labor that goes into keeping the money valuable, that goes into keeping it pumped up and making it into something that is actually liquid, right? Like, you know, you couldn't transact, there were stretches where you couldn't transact Bitcoin any more than you could transact, you know, Confederate notes or something, because no one would take them. Like, the infrastructure was there and that all worked, but, you know, except for occasional kind of like fun goofs, like buying what in retrospect became the world's most expensive pizza for 10,000 Bitcoins when Bitcoins were worthless, just as like a proof of concept. Like aside from those things, there was kind of no actual action happening. There was no movement. And what we see in practice is that it's like the Wizard of Oz, right? Like the huge, beautiful, inhuman machine functions because it's filled with humans, you know, that are like turning the dials and spinning the wheels and making the promises and keeping the sort of hype cycle functioning. And yeah.
I was really struck by, I mean, you mentioned this really briefly at the beginning of the talk, but when we were talking a few months ago, you mentioned growing the beard so that you could kind of fit in with these backwoods libertarian types in New Hampshire and be able to talk to them. And that's a really interesting thing, because this kind of, you know, your appearance is part of what gets them to trust you enough to talk to you. I want to move on to a couple of, we have several questions in the talk, in the chat here, and two of them are about China. Let me ask them both. Could you say a little bit about the paradox of, number one, China, an authoritarian government, being the site of a lot of Bitcoin mining and proof of work, to the degree that they can potentially manipulate the value of the coins? And two, huge megacorporation Facebook wants in on the game and proposes the Libra system. In either case, is the Blacknet legacy of trying to undermine governments being turned on its head or still at work?
Oh, those are great questions. And they're very related, actually, in some ways, too, which I think maybe a good way to start with this would be to say that like over the last couple of years, I've witnessed this like enormous crisis of soul within a lot of developer communities that are, especially the more kind of radically committed ones that are working in this space. And the crisis of soul is the fact that, and I have my own kind of complex, like, you know, philosophical beliefs and disagreements with them, but at heart, I sympathize with their, I think in some ways, deepest conviction, even beyond political philosophy, which was the idea that we could design a technology that would be inherently destabilizing, right? And so, I mean, assume for purposes of this conversation that destabilization is a good thing. And actually something that will maybe help us to situate this a little bit is to remember that when this stuff was being developed, when I was talking about those challenges where a lot of these things were being worked out, in that era, the cypherpunks were also fighting tooth and nail against a government that was trying to keep any form of strong encryption out of the hands of civilians, right? Like they were people who were participating directly in legal battles to make sure that we would have some measure of the protections that we actually now enjoy. So it's good to remember that that was kind of the space that they were in. So the other outcome of that, which brings us back to these two questions, is that they really saw cryptography as being a technology of liberation and a technology that was liberating in and of itself, right? Like the deployment of strong encryption and all the kind of related tools that strong encryption could provide, like blind signatures, all of those things were going to render many forms of authoritarian government fundamentally impossible, right? Like there was a real kind of like, there was a weird almost like quietism to parts of it where you go back and read some of these manifestos and it's basically, well, we can just sit back, you know, like once the technology is out there, it's just going to like, you know, trickle like acid through every sort of, you know, locked down institution in the world and just make it fall to pieces. And part of what we've been witnessing over the last 3 or 4 years in particular has been a lot of those beliefs being called into question, right? As people are suddenly like, wait a second, like not only is like the Fed not afraid of Bitcoin, they're actually like, you know, the biggest institutional banks in the world are rolling their own cryptocurrency tools, you know, so many of which are not meant for day-to-day transactions, but other kinds of settlement, but they're cool with it, you know, and like lots of different groups are able to see it as a normal asset class that can be like taxable and recognized in the same way that you would manage any kind of, you know, collectible. And China in particular was a huge blow to a lot of people. The adoption of cryptocurrency tools and platforms in China, because I think that really like shook up the idea that there was something that was fundamentally destabilizing and anarchic in this technology itself.
Right.
So I would say a couple of things about that. Oh, sorry, yeah.
We have another question, which is actually about what are your thoughts on China's plans to launch a digital yuan?
Yeah. Yes, so I'm a historian, and historians, we stink at predictions because we always end up hedging and second guessing too much because, we know how much of history is all about contingency and unforeseen effects and things like that. But I'll do my best in a way that I think might answer all three of these in different ways to make a big sweeping prediction, which are that the history of single sovereign territorial currencies is actually a relatively short history, right? Like it's actually pretty recent. The idea that if you lived in a country, you would have one kind of money. That kind of money would be issued and managed by the country or by a central bank. And then that would be how you would transact to the exclusion of most other things. And then you would change money to cross borders. That was always fragile and not completely true, right? Even in the context of the most, sort of sovereign currency periods in the United States, for instance, there were still, all kinds of things, coupons and tickets and, military scrip and company towns issuing their own currencies, blah, blah, blah. There were always lots and lots of different transactional forms. But nonetheless, there was a period that you could identify over about 200 plus years where we saw a tremendous shift away from what most of human history had been a fairly diverse and mixed spread of currencies, in which, for example, rich people would have access to things like bills of exchange and letters of credit. Poor people would have access to a variety of different forms of coinage, kinship networks, debt systems, yada, yada, yada. So I think we are entering a future in which we are going to see a huge proliferation of new currency forms. And a lot of those currency forms, all those currency forms are going to be digital. A lot of them are going to be things that are going to take advantage of the properties of digital currency in ways that you could not with paper. And that offers us a real set of both promises and challenges, right? So number one, promises. A sort of suite and array of digital currencies means that you can finally have much more fine-grained ability to try to tune and manage an economy, right? We've all witnessed the catastrophe of the sort of, bailout funds that people were supposed to receive in the middle of coronavirus in the United States. And there's a bunch of reasons why the catastrophe happened. It's not news to anybody. But in a digital context, you could do things like actively sort of fiddle with the economy in small day-to-day ways, in ways that we can see early versions of in the form of, for example, central banks going into negative interest rates in an effort to kind of get liquidity back up or goose the operation of particular corners of the economy, make certain kinds of money available to particular people. There's a lot of potential value there. And my personal analysis is that I think that that's a major area of interest for the Chinese government, right? It's not just about, surveillance or coercion, even though that absolutely plays a role in trying to get these systems more widely adopted, but it's also the ability to forestall social chaos through being able to do these very fine-grained systems of economic management and relief payment and so on. We can see a version of this in India with the Aadhaar system becoming part of how relief payment is, and food relief is circulated and made available. The other thread in this big future prediction is that a lot of these forms of new digital currency will be corporate. They will be emerging, we can already see proto versions of this in things like the points systems that are used for credit cards. Starbucks. One of my colleagues, Lana Swartz, is coming out with a book about transactional communities. And she writes about Starbucks as Starbucks is kind of a bank. There's a huge amount of financial float that happens on Starbucks cards. Right. And Starbucks has actually talked about issuing their own currency. And obviously Howard Schultz talks about a lot of things, but they are actually in a really good position to become something like the way, for example, Japan has post office banking. Starbucks is in a really good position to kind of become their own bank. And when we look at things like that, I think we should cast our mind. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
We got a couple more questions in because we're running out of time. I mean, everything is fascinating, but I do want to respect our audience here.
Yes.
Actually, let me just read this one as more as a comment because you just answered a lot of it, but Harold Trinkunas writes a very interesting talk. Can you comment on the proliferation of cryptocurrencies that followed Bitcoin, which was accompanied by an explosion of misinformation and disinformation about their relative value and reliability? That is, comments about shitcoins.
Yeah.
To the extent that cryptocurrencies rely on people accepting these scarce digital objects as valuable, does this attract efforts to socially manipulate perceptions as deliberate disinformation campaigns?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you talked about some of that just now, and I'll leave that one there. But I also want to get to this one from Herb Lynn, who says, the title of your talk spoke of a contradiction about how cryptocurrencies are of interest to both anarchists and governments. How is this different from asserting that guns are useful for both criminals and cops? I learned a lot about interesting aspects of the history, but I don't understand the depth of the contradiction that the title suggests.
That's a very good question. I think so, and I did like as I was kind of working through this. I wanted to, I guess in a way, this is maybe an example of the problem with the talk of like, as it were, kind of reverse engineering something. Because part of what I thought would be, especially of interest to this audience, would be understanding the ways in which this is a widespread technology that emerges from an explicit goal of destabilizing the ability of states to control things, of states to manage borders, of states to manage money, of states to police transactions. And so I tried to kind of work backwards from that into thinking about how I would frame that question. And I think for me, this may be something I don't really know the answer to yet, but part of what I'm really fascinated by is what I've been calling this paradox of trustlessness. The fact that there's something really interesting about trying to build these technologies which are premised on forms of universal transparency or distributed consensus so that there's no need to trust an institution. And it's really interesting to me to see how different groups make use of that sort of set of technologies, how these different agendas can all come together around this premise of a trustless system. Maybe a good way to frame that would be to say that it's, maybe paradox or contradiction is too strong a word, because I very much take your point about the comparison to firearms. But rather than to say that the puzzle of how it is that something that seemed so well suited to one social political outcome ended up being much more widely applicable and applicable in very different ways than it was designed to be.
Of course, we could say
something
that
along those lines. Yeah.
A lot of things that, so in a way, what the paradox you're talking about is kind of a historical paradox, where it comes out of one kind of community that's very oppositional and turns into a kind of establishment system that can serve all the same purposes that have always been served by governments. But of course, we can say this about all kinds of things related to the internet. The early electronic frontier turned into the digital marketplace that really looks like a shopping mall.
Yeah.
And but also firearms. The many people in this country on the right think of owning firearms as a sort of way that they will at least symbolically resist the power of government. But the government also makes guns and uses guns for its own purposes and has a, so anyway, let me get to a couple more of these comments in our last few minutes here. I don't know, Weissel Brown would like to know, I've been thinking about blockchain technologies and how they seem to provide a way to mediate trust, but I've been unsatisfied with the concept of trust in these discourses and wants to know more about how you think about that. I want to try to gather a couple more questions under that heading. How does regulation and enforcement work in this system?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And there is another question that came up much earlier, which is kind of far afield from the main line here, but Lauren would like to know something about using blockchain or distributed ledgers for treaty verification. There's another sort of government tool that where this has been, at least some people.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in the last couple of minutes, maybe I can like kind of find a way to tie a bunch of these different threads together in that. So the strangest thing about the sort of story that I feel like I've tried to tell here is that it starts out being a story about people who want to make money, that will enable all of these different sort of strange functions that I tried to outline at the beginning of the talk. But to do that, to create a system in which you didn't need to trust another person in order to sort of transact these digital objects, they ended up creating a really extraordinary single trusted object. And that is the blockchain itself, which is really just like an append only distributed digital ledger, right? Like an object to which you can add things, those things can never be altered and never be removed, and that ledger is like widely shared and verified and distributed across many users. And there's usually some kind of consensus mechanism for adding stuff to the ledger. So part of what that means is that what you've ultimately created is a kind of system for the management and scrutiny of promises, you know, or like past events. So I think it could absolutely be used for like, but again, right, like all of these things, there's a semantic drift that happens. I was about to say it can absolutely be used for treaty verification, when in fact, of course, it can't. It can only be used to prove that a promise was made at such and such a time, you know, that can then be like, you know, cryptographically signed in an irrefutable way or what have you. But the verification ultimately comes back to us, comes back to the people who would be in charge of like, you know, like supervising compliance, whatever form that may take. And this also like speaks again to the fact that there is in many ways a very shallow and facile way that trust gets used in all of this, right? Like, trustlessness ends up kind of migrating from starting out as a political claim that this is something that does not rely on the sort of one of the great libertarian, you know, bugbears, which is trusted third parties, and can instead be verified by the individual themselves, and sort of slowly migrates into the idea of a system that has replaced trust with something else. Sometimes that's consensus. Sometimes there's a variety of different kinds of words and phrases that get deployed to try to kind of fill in that gap. But I think for our purposes, for thinking about the future, it's especially interesting to think about which institutions, which contexts, which businesses and projects and goals find that they can get value out of having a system that can replace the kind of trusted third party intermediary with something else, with something that can work in this other way.
Yeah. Okay, well, I talked to you all day, and I wish we could, but our time is just about up. So, I mean, in lieu of applause, I will clap. There's a lot of interest. We got a lot of questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to the last few, but thank you so much, and we will see you again pretty soon, I hope, at either live or on Zoom as you move into the Bay Area community, and really welcome from STS and CSAC and all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you all for sharing your morning with me. And please feel free to email with further questions. I would love to kind of talk through these ideas more with everyone.